probably like, I don't know, 10 gallons or something. And it said these shrimp have been in here for years and nothing has gone in except for light. The thing is, these shrimp are so hardy, their oxygen needs are so modest, their food needs are so modest, that you can buy one of those and keep it for years and have the shrimp survive, which is amazing, but it's not ideal for them. A professor at a university in Hawaii who collected 6 shrimp and had them in this gallon jar. He didn't open that container for 20 years. And at the end of 20 years, there were about 50 shrimp in there. What else could you put in a jar for 20 years and not touch and find that they had reproduced?
In your opinion, what do you think the easiest pet to care for is? I think many things kind of immediately pop to mind, maybe hermit crabs or goldfish, things along those lines. But quite often when we have quote unquote easy pets, that's often a marketing term. And when you actually learn the requirements of those pets, they actually are way more involved than we are led to believe. When you buy that hermit crab from a hut on the beach, it doesn't actually just need a piece of lettuce every once in a while. There's more to the care that is required. But in today's episode, we're talking about an animal that actually does have an incredibly limited amount of input from the keeper, and the husbandry is unbelievably simple, and that has everything to do with how this group of animals evolved and the conditions that they exist in the wild. Today we're talking about upai ula shrimp, also known as Hawaiian Volcano Shrimp, and I'm speaking with Russ from Aquarimax Pets. These animals are absolutely unbelievable. I mean, there's reports of them living in a jar for 20 plus years and not only not dying, but breeding. And we're talking about a jar that didn't have any input, no feeding, no water changes, maybe water top-ups, but nothing more than that. They are unbelievably robust. And by the way, we're not going to actually promote keeping them that way. The point is that these are unbelievably robust animals, and they actually are a perfect candidate for somebody who wants a simple pet that can give you a bunch of life, maybe on your computer desk or wherever you want, a small little aquarium that is bursting with activity and life and will not require much input on your part at all. In the episode, Russ walks us through their natural history, where they're found in Hawaii, and these really unique pools that they're found in and why that lends themselves to being such a good pet. We discuss how they've ended up in the gimmick pet market, how they're being sold in these sort of sealed snow globe type scenarios. We discuss their husbandry, how to set up the tanks, how to mature the tanks, the algae that needs to grow in them, maybe tank mates that are potential options for them. We discuss breeding, lighting, diet, common mistakes, and so much more. I hope you enjoyed this episode because I know I did, and once I'm done recording this intro and outro, I'm definitely hopping on Google and seeing if I can find anyone in Canada that works with these shrimp because they have definitely piqued my interest, and I know it will pique your interest as well. Enjoy the episode, and we will talk to you afterwards. This podcast is all about improving your reptile husbandry. However, I know not everybody has the time or the money to go out and spend thousands of dollars doing custom builds. Thankfully, friend of the podcast, Josh Halter, aka the Bio Dude, is working hard to make better care more accessible. He makes turnkey bioactive kits for leopard geckos, ball pythons, tortoises, invertebrates, dart frogs, and the list continues to grow. He has spent years testing and perfecting these handcrafted substrates and dietary supplements to create the most effective products. If you visit thebiodude.com, you will see he is a proud supporter of both USARK and responsible reptile keeping, and there is an option to donate to either at checkout. There are different styles of thermostat, on, off, or dimming. Personally, I much prefer a dimming thermostat because I run essentially all halogen heating in my reptile room, and I don't want those bulbs turning on and off to control temperature and stressing out the animal and strobing out all day. I would much rather the bulb either dim or increase in power to control the temperature, and that can only be done with a dimming thermostat. That's why I'm so excited to tell you more about a brand new product from Zoomed, the Repti Temp dimming thermostat. If you're interested in learning more about that, stick around through the rest of the episode and you'll find out more. Awesome. Well, Russ, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for returning.
Yeah, I'm happy to be back.
I'm really looking forward to this. I'm trying my best to do episodes of the podcast that have a much more narrow focus because I think it's just better for people. They're just looking for a topic and they get an episode on it. And so you suggested this maybe a month or two ago, and I'm like, this is perfect. This is exactly my goal these days. So we'll jump into that very soon. But for folks who are not familiar with you, we did an episode maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago now. Probably, I forget. Was it last year?
It's somewhere around there. I don't remember either exactly.
So we did an episode mostly focused on isopods, and to maybe just give people kind of a background of what you keep right now. What does your animal room look like?
Yeah, well, I certainly do keep isopods of various sorts, although I've downsized that a little bit because I'm trying to focus more on things that make sense for me and not just, hey, let's make sure I can collect all the isopods. It's more about, is this is this a good decision for me, this species, for what my goals, But I do have quite a few species though still. I have a lot of other invertebrates. I have a tarantula, I have a couple of scorpions, I have some tailless whip scorpions, I have an aquatic insect tank, including like aquatic beetles and water striders and things like that. I've got a desert communal beetle setup that also has some other things in there too, but mostly beetles, desert beetles. I've got a lot of live foods that I work with, like live food cultures, like daphnia and scuds and mealworms and crickets and fruit flies and flower beetles and microworms. And I just started a new project with breeding blackworms, which people who keep aquatic amphibians or fish will probably know what I'm talking about. So I hadn't bred those before, so I'm working on that now. We've got dart frogs, Pac-Man frog, and axolotl. Got a few different kinds of geckos, like a couple of cresties and some mourning geckos. I do a little breeding with garter snakes. We have backyard chickens. We have half a dozen aquariums with fish in them. We've got a cat. I mean, we've got a lot of different things going on.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but your camera just flicked off, but you were on a roll, so I didn't want to interrupt you, but I'm not sure if it just one of those.
Let's see if I can get it to flick back on. I'm hoping. What's going on?
Yeah, you're back. I'll let you know if it happens again. But yeah, so you have quite a good spectrum of animals, and for people that do want to follow up with you, because you do have some great informational content as well on YouTube channel. So can you just quickly let everybody know what the YouTube channel name is for those that don't know, and then also just the type of content that you put on there?
Yeah, it's Aquarimax Pets, and you can probably see that on the screen. Aquarimax Pets. Some people struggle with the spelling when they hear me say it, but it comes from the fact that I started just with aquarium content, and my middle name is Max, and so Aquarimax. And that is my YouTube channel and my Instagram and Facebook and whatnot. I'm on most of the social media, but mostly YouTube. And it's all about anything you can keep in an aquarium or vivarium. So I do content on all the things that I talked about and more.
Perfect. Okay, awesome. Well, I would love to jump into the topic today, which is Hawaiian shrimp. I think there's many names, so I'll let you kind of rifle through the names. So why don't we start with that? Start with the name of the species and some of the common names that are given to it, and then we'll get into way more detail.
Yeah, sure. Well, Halocaridina rubra is the scientific name, which means something like red salt shrimp. Rubra being red and halo being salt and caridina being shrimp. So this shrimp is also known as opaiula in Hawaiian, which means like either a red shrimp or a lobster shrimp. It can be translated both ways, as I recall. Hawaiian volcano shrimp is a popular name for them. Hawaiian lava shrimp is another one. Hawaiian red shrimp. There's so many different names for them, but those are probably the most common.
Are these like if someone were to walk us through your general fish store, is that going to be something that's in many regular aquarium shops, or is it something slightly more niche than that?
It's a bit more niche. I've seen them in a couple of aquarium shops, maybe just one or two in my lifetime, and I think they are becoming a little bit more popular now.
So the reason that we wanted to talk about them today, from my understanding, is they could make a great beginner pet. That's why I asked if they're sort of common to see, but they're also, it could potentially be the easiest possible pet if we were to have a competition for all animals. So I think that's why it makes them very interesting. But let's start with their physical description. I'd love for listeners to kind of have an understanding of what they look like, and also we'll get into some natural history aspects of them as well.
Okay, well, they are a very typical shrimp shape. If you're familiar with red cherry shrimp, a lot of people who have kept aquariums are familiar with those. They have that same shape. So just your typical thought when you think of a live shrimp, that's kind of the shape they have, but they are much smaller than like a red cherry shrimp you'd see in a pet store. They get up to about 1.5 centimeters long. And they're not necessarily even that big. So they're quite small. And when you think of a red cherry shrimp that people may be familiar with, the females might get a little bit over an inch long, but when you think about 1.5 centimeters long, the mass is much, much smaller too. There's a lot less shrimp in that small package. And they tend to be red, not surprisingly, but that varies with locality of the shrimp. It varies with the food that they eat. It varies with stress levels. And even there's some mutations out there. So if you stress out your shrimp, they can go transparent for a while. Also, lighting can change their color. So if they've been in the dark for a while, they'll tend not to be very red, and then as they come out into light, they'll turn redder and things like that. So that's something I think that adds to their appeal, that their colors can change, and you get to see how different things affect them.
Yeah, yeah. And then as far as where their native habitat, obviously you had mentioned that one of their common names is the Hawaii volcano shrimp. So
Yeah,
are they endemic to Hawaii?
they are. They're completely endemic to Hawaii, and Hawaii. Some people maybe don't think of it this way, but Hawaii is really one of the most isolated places on Earth as far as species that can get there. The fish that live around the Hawaiian Islands are not nearly as varied as fish that live in a lot of other coral reef areas, because the only fish that have ever managed to get there, besides some that have been introduced, but just naturally managed to get there, are ones that have very long larval stages. They're just floating around in the plankton that they can survive. If they don't have a long larval stage, they don't survive long enough to get there in a planktonic stage, and they've never made it there. So we don't have like the clownfish in Hawaii, for example.
Mm.
And so it's a very, very isolated environment. And these shrimp exist in the ecosystem, if we want to get into that, for these shrimp, is really, really fascinating,
Yes, please.
because there are these very unusual uh, pools in Hawaii. And these pools exist in some other places, but these shrimp only exist in this kind of pool in Hawaii. So the type of pool is called an ankyline pool, and it is defined by several important factors. One, it is connected to the ocean, but only connected to the ocean underground. There's no surface connection to the ocean, and it can be quite a distance from the ocean. So you're not going to find an ankyline pool necessarily right on the beach. It could be, many meters away from the ocean, but it is connected underneath through a network of this kind of porous lava material that the Hawaiian Islands are made of. In some cases, it's like ancient coral that's, long dead fossilized coral, but it still has that porosity. But in most cases, it's just the lava the islands are made of. And so seawater is seeping through there slowly. But as it does, it's acting as a kind of a filter. And so it's filtering out other organisms to a large extent, organisms that can't get through these tiny little networks. And it is also being fed by rainwater that becomes groundwater, or just, that falls into the pools. And so there's a mixture between fresh and salt, so brackish water that varies quite a bit in salinity based on various things going on. And there's actually a dampened tidal fluctuation in these pools. So even though they're not connected to the ocean on the surface, because they are underneath, the pool water level will go up and down with the tides slightly. Not as much as the tides do in the ocean, but it still fluctuates.
Wow, that is fascinating. So I guess you can already start kind of building a picture of why they're so robust. Is they're dealing with varying conditions all the time. How large, like how much volume would these pools typically be? Like maybe don't give you a volume, but like if you were standing next to it, how far across might these things look?
I've seen pictures of them in various sizes, and to give you like an extreme example, there's a city. I used to live in Hawaii. I lived there for several years,
Oh,
and
okay.
when I did, there was an city just right next to the small town that I lived in, and someone lifted up a brick, and underneath this brick was just like a little seepage of water, and one of these shrimp was found there under this brick.
Wow.
So that's how small an ankyline pool technically could be. And then I've seen some that look like lakes, and then everything in between. Unfortunately, they're pretty rare in Hawaii. They always have been fairly rare. It's kind of an unusual thing, but they're much rarer than they used to be because of development. Uh,
Right.
Partly because people just say, "Oh, I don't care about this. I'm paving this over and making a parking lot for a hotel or something like that." But also people say, "Oh, I love this pool, and there's just these tiny little shrimp in it. They may not even notice them. Like I'm going to put koi in it or whatever." And koi can handle some level of brackish water, and some of the other fish can. Tilapia that have been introduced to Hawaii can stand that level of brackish water very easily. And so some of these fish have been introduced into the ponds or the pools. And then, of course, the shrimp can't thrive because the fish will eat them. And so the shrimp either stay underneath the lava level and maybe get what they can, what nutrients they can from residual things that fall down into there, or they just stay out of the pools entirely.
Right. So is there anything naturally larger than the shrimp in those pools, or are they the kind of like the apex predator in those scenarios?
There are a few things. There is another species of shrimp that appears in a couple of other ecosystems. It's not endemic to Hawaii, but does occur there. And right now, I think the scientific name starts with an M. I don't remember the genus exactly, but I think the species name is Lohena. But they're these large shrimp with large chelipeds that hunt the opaiula.
Okay.
So they do exist. There aren't very many predators, but I think you hit upon a point that I think is useful to mention, that one of the reasons why these shrimp are so unique is that they've carved out this niche in a place, or niche, however you want to pronounce it, in a place where so many other organisms can't thrive. And unfortunately, with development and so on, we've introduced other species that can thrive in those places. But before that, there were relatively few species that they were competing with in these pools.
Right. So then how do the shrimp make it to those pools? Obviously, there's generations and generations of them living in these pools that are existing. But as far as initially, are they seeping in from the ocean, or is it just from so long ago when that entire island had water on top of it, before it was essentially an island? Where did they come from?
Well, this is kind of crazy, but and I don't know that I have the full answer for you, but I can tell you something that is illustrative of this concept. Kind of gives us an idea. Okay, years and years ago, decades ago, they did some bomb testing on a small uninhabited Hawaiian island. I think it's Kaho'olawe, I think is the name of it. Very, very small island. And in this bomb testing, they created a crater. And the crater almost immediately began to fill with water. And very, very quickly, these shrimp showed up. So they were living underground in these, all these cracks and crevices and tunnels in the lava.
Wow.
And as soon as this pool appeared, they were colonizing it. And so what is probably going on is that underneath all the Hawaiian Islands and probably under the ocean in that area, they can survive in ocean water. The salinity doesn't really bother them as far as the individuals go. It does seem to have an effect on their breeding. It reduces their breeding ability, probably. But and certainly predation would be crazy in the ocean. But as far as salinity, it's not a problem. So they may be, traveling between these pools partly in the ocean, but they may also just be using these tunnels that is through this porous lava that's filled with water of various salinities, and they don't have any problem traveling through it.
That is fascinating. So that tells you how small they are, and the fact that they live. It's probably, you just picture like basically a network of tiny tunnels, which is or not even tunnels really, because it's just porous rocks. So they just make a bunch of cavities within these rocks that they live within. And I guess you probably don't have to go very far to basically have saturated lava rock that is saturated with water.
Right, exactly. And they also have if you think about it this way, these pools are probably just places where they can access nutrients. So they may be spending long months, years, maybe even just under the ground exclusively in these areas. And then when they come up into the pool, that's a place where they can get food, because there's detritus, there's insects that die, there's algae that's growing, all these things that are happening that can provide food for them.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And really, their role in the ecosystem in that environment is just essentially cleaning up those little pools, essentially. I mean, they just pop up and there's food for them. It's such a tiny little ecosystem that it's almost simple just to figure out exactly what's going on there, because you have basically a predator, and then detritus and algae, like you said, that needs to be cleaned up.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And apparently the shrimp in certain times, there are stories that the Hawaiian people have of times when the pools would just turn red, because you'd have thousands upon thousands of the shrimp ascend into these pools and feed. And
wow.
That's something I would have liked to see. I never got to see that, but would have been cool.
So do you remember when you first encountered them in the pet trade? Did you already know of them as a pet, quote unquote, when you experienced them in the wild when you were living in Hawaii, or was that something that happened later?
Well, when I was a teenager, so it was years before I lived in Hawaii. I saw some sort of documentary on long-term culture of organisms. I don't remember exactly what the point of the documentary was, but it had this basically globe of glass with a bunch of these shrimp in it, and it had been sealed off. and it was a fairly large globe, uh, probably like, I don't know, 10 gallons or something. And it said these shrimp have been in here for years and nothing has gone in except for light. And I was fascinated by this idea. That's the first time I ever heard of the shrimp, but I didn't hear much more about them for many years, except to see once in a while these globes that were for sale, and thinking, wow, those are interesting, but is that really, how does that really work? Does it really work? And so on. And just full disclosure, I don't recommend those globes. People do find them. People will sell them in catalogs or whatnot. You'll see them in department stores once in a while, that kind of thing.
It's like a gimmicky gift. Like it's like legitimately a sealed sphere of a glass sphere with water inside and a couple of shrimp that you can never access unless you broke it open.
Right. You'd have to drill it or do something to get in there. And the thing is, these shrimp are so hardy. Their oxygen needs are so modest. Their food needs are so modest that you can buy one of those and keep it for years and have the shrimp survive, which is amazing. It's a testament to the absolute, hardiness of these shrimp, but it's not ideal for them. They don't tend to breed in those setups, and they will do some weird things like if they don't get enough algae growing on the glass and so on, when they molt, they'll often molt out smaller than they were.
Wow.
Because they're actually losing body mass through that molt and not, it perhaps prolongs their life to be able to do that, but it's not good for them. They'll often lose their color too. So yeah, I don't recommend that as an option for obtaining shrimp or for an option for keeping them either.
The best part about providing high-quality reptile husbandry is you get to develop a long-term relationship with your animal. Meet Jackson, my 18-year-old crested gecko. Jackson lives on the BioDudes Terrafauna substrate, which is one of their substrates that's specifically designed for warm biomes and humidity spikes. Like all other BioDudes substrates, it contains organic content to help support the plant life in Jackson's vivarium. It also holds moisture very well, which means humidity is never an issue, even in my dry climate. Another favorite of mine is the BioDudes Bug Grub. This is a supplement powder made from natural ingredients like carrots, beets, spirulina, oats, and potatoes. Everybody knows how important gut-loading feeder insects is, and this simplifies it for me and allows me to be confident when I feed both Jackson and my tarantulas that they're getting the nutrients they need to thrive. Also, if you have a lot of babies right now, this is a great way to help fortify the diets of neonatal reptiles. The BioDude has a ton of great educational content on both his YouTube channel and the website, all about bioactive care, and it's just one of those brands that's doing their part to push herpetoculture into a positive direction and give reptile keeping a better name. Yeah, so in those scenarios, they're actually eating some, algae that grows on the inside of the glass. It could be even microscopic, right, that you can barely even see to our naked eye. And right. So when they die, who knows why they're dying, but I just think there's no oxygen exchange really happening in that water. Does the water eventually, I guess they'll always be able to breathe because, I just think, doesn't that water become so stagnant and oxygen deprived that they would die? Or
you would think so, and their oxygen needs are really, really low compared to many organisms, probably as an adaptation to living in these. I can't imagine that in the middle of miles of these lava tubes that the water is very oxygenated. It's got to have
right.
some. And of course, they're living organisms; they need some oxygen, but their metabolisms are lower than what you would expect at their size, and they just don't need very much. So I'm guessing that in most cases that the oxygen, there's enough algae growth in these containers, as long as they're being maintained, with some semblance of light, that they're getting some algal growth, and that will give them enough oxygen.
Right. And then as far as when you picked up your first group of shrimp, was that recently, or when did you first start keeping them?
It was a long time ago. It was in Hawaii, and it was 2004. So I guess okay. I've been keeping them a little over 20 years.
Wow.
And I fortunately did not get mine from one of the companies that keeps them in the the little sealed globes. The person I got them from, who's no longer in the business. In fact, the gentleman has passed away now, but he was promoting them as pets that needed to be fed, and he was trying to improve the husbandry that was given to these, which I appreciate. I think that's great, and we've learned some things since 2004. But at the time, he was saying they do need to be fed. They need containers that should allow for oxygen exchange and things like that. So he was promoting some of these things, and that helped.
Now, Are they sold even now? Are they sold as a standalone? This is a pet that you would keep in an enclosure by itself, or do people add them to community aquariums?
Well, sort of a complicated answer, but it's a fun and interesting one, I think. The shrimp themselves, if you were to try to keep them with most fish, they would just be eaten.
Right.
And brackish fish, any kind of fish. I mean, they're very adaptable. They don't do well in pure freshwater, but they can do it fairly well in low salinity brackish water, and they can do well up to, excuse me, up to seawater salinity and even a little higher, at least survive, even if they don't breed very well. But I've heard people keeping them with dwarf seahorses, not with bigger seahorses. Bigger seahorses, people actually go and collect these from the ankyline pools and sell them as seahorse food for larger seahorses.
Oh, okay.
But dwarf seahorses are too small to eat the adults, but people will put them in with the seahorses, and they will sometimes, release babies even into the saltwater environment, and the seahorses will eat the babies. So I've heard of that happening. I've never tried that myself. I have kept them with some other organisms. But when you think of, with mini shrimp, like in the aquarium hobby, red cherry shrimp, or any of the other color varieties of that same group, you have a lot of options. You can't just keep them with anything because a lot of things will eat them, but you have a lot of options for tank mates. But with these, they're fewer. But there are a few that are pretty standard and a lot of people use. The Malaysian trumpet snail, which is often known as a pest in aquaria and whatnot. This is a very interesting thing about this snail. It's adaptable to brackish water. It can even be acclimated to full ocean water. And so it tends to make a good tank mate. And people often think, well, those snails breed like crazy. So why would I want to put them in with these snails, with these shrimp? The interesting thing about those snails is that in the environment that these shrimp thrive in, it's a very low nutrient environment compared to most freshwater tanks. And it also has, it has a high amount of calcium because these shrimp thrive with a high amount of calcium carbonate in the water. And so you need to provide that as part of the environment. And these snails do really well in there, but they slow down in their breeding. They don't get to as big a size, but they breed just fine. But they just breed at a snail's pace.
Okay, so you're not gonna have a whole wall of snails.
Right, which you could have in a freshwater aquarium at the levels you're feeding. But these shrimp get so little food. I mean, feeding them is ridiculous. When we get to the husbandry for these shrimp, I mean, so little food goes into the aquarium that it's basically an oligotrophic environment as opposed to a eutrophic environment, which most freshwater tanks are. And so you don't have that problem of overpopulation with the snails.
Okay, that's fascinating. And then, like you said, we will get into the husbandry because I'm just fascinated by that as well. But if these snails are kept under really good conditions and they have proper lighting and you are feeding them as sparingly as you need to, what's the lifespan on something like this?
This is amazing too. Another amazing thing about these shrimp. There is a forum that has been going on for years. I think I discovered this forum before I moved to Hawaii in 2004. Okay, and it still exists. And I may be wrong about the dates, but it's been around a good long time. And there is someone on there who had one of these globes with the shrimp in it and documented, when they got it and everything. And they posted about it in 2013, and they had already had the shrimp for a long time before that. And they documented when they got it and everything. And the shrimp are over 30 years old. The individual shrimp, not just the descendants of the individual shrimp, the actual individual shrimp.
In one of the globe things.
In one of the globe things. So they are taking care of it as best they can. And most of them don't get very good care in those things. But this person has, dedicated some time and energy to discovering what they can do to better the lives of the shrimp, even within this globe thing. And it's amazing that they can live so long.
So in an actual setup, it could be basically your entire lifetime, probably. Who knows how long they could live? Yeah.
We're not even sure how long they can live. And since they do breed readily in captivity, you could definitely have a lifetime colony with very little effort.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the husbandry. You kind of mentioned where they fit within the hobby as far as, you could potentially cohabit them have tank mates of snails. Is there anything else you'd said? Maybe was it just maybe a other few species of snail, or is really the Malaysian trumpets is really the only good option for tank mates?
There are a couple of others. There's one that on that forum that I mentioned, it's called petshrimp.com. They talk about another species, and the guy who owns the website, yeah, sells them too. And he has another species very similar to Malaysian trumpet snails in its habits and so on that he uh, also keeps with them. I've never kept them with it, but I've kept other things with them, and I don't necessarily recommend all of them, but I have experimented with it, back in the day. I'm a little bit more conservative with it, I think, what I would keep with them now, but uh, I do keep an olive nerite that I've had for like a decade, which is another kind of snail that's popular in the aquarium hobby for eating algae. And I've had it with some of my shrimp for probably 10 years.
Okay.
And it does pretty well too. That one's just a little tougher because you need to make sure it gets enough algae without eating too much of the algae so it doesn't. So I have to kind of overgrow the algae in that tank to make sure it's okay. I've kept hermit crabs with them successfully. I've kept a small species of serpent star with them as well. So I've kept a few different things with them, and I don't necessarily recommend all of those things. At some point, we should talk about the kind of plant life you can keep with them too. But I think in general, it's safest to just go with the few species of snail that do well with them and just focus on them as the main inhabitant.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say somebody's just going to set up strictly shrimp colony here. Let's walk through. Let's start with the tank setup. Like the size of the tank, and then you'd mentioned brackish water. So I'd love to hear about how we set up the water conditions as well. So what size of tank, and then we can get to the water.
Sure. Yeah. One thing to think about is that the aquarium that they would need, you can start out with something really small. Like if you want to go with a half a gallon, you could keep 50 to 100 shrimp in a half a gallon.
Really?
Because they're so small and their bioload is negligible. Like I said, their metabolisms are much lower than they would be for, say, cherry shrimp or fish or anything of that that you might keep in a tank. So I would recommend going a little bigger if you can. And I've kept them in things as when I originally got them from the gentleman I mentioned before in Hawaii, he sent me 1/2 gallon tank and then some, I think they were pint tanks.
Oh, wow.
Pint tanks had like half a dozen in each, and then there were like 30 or something in the half gallon. And but I would say somewhere between 1 and 10 gallons is a sweet spot for those people who really want to keep it minimal and you want a minimal footprint, minimal effort, all that kind of stuff. You can go with a 1 or 2 gallon tank. It's fine. That's not a problem at all. And you can have breeding in there. So if you start out with, say, 10, 15 shrimp, if you do well with it and you're careful, you don't overfeed it, you could easily, have several dozen in there at least, and they'll be fine. And as long as you don't overfeed, they should kind of manage their population to fit in that enclosure.
Okay, cool. And then as far as getting the water conditions right, it sounds like they can handle quite a variation of salinity. So what do you do to at least get some salt in there and to balance it?
Yeah, this is a very important thing. It does have to be like the type of salt you would use to make a marine aquarium. People sometimes get confused because you can go to the pet store and you can buy aquarium salt that is not intended for use with marine organisms. It's used to treat diseases of freshwater fish, for example. So that's definitely out. That will not work. But if you get marine grade salt that is used for creating like a reef tank or a saltwater fish tank, or whatever, if you can get that, that's what you want. And then you need to mix it with distilled water or very pure water. If you can get like nice grade RO water, a reverse osmosis water, something like that. It needs to be very, very pure water with basically no minerals in it. So distilled water is usually the easiest one for people to get. They can go to the grocery store and just pick it up. So not spring water, not purified drinking water. It has to be like
H2O.
Yeah, very, very pure. So distilled water is just the easiest one to go with. And you mix that, and most of these, all of the marine salt that you buy, you can buy it as, the powdered salt, or you can buy it as pre-mixed marine salt. If you're making a small tank, it can be more economical to just go buy a gallon of premixed marine salt and then mix that with a gallon of distilled water. Now you have 2 gallons and you're good to go. And that is often cheaper than buying salt water because many times when you want to buy salt water, they have a minimum quantity.
Mm.
And a lot of stores will only have this much makes 50 gallons, and you'll never use that unless you're making a huge tank. So um, you might want to go with just the premixed salt mixed for a marine tank. But you can do whatever. You can sometimes find online, this is 15 gallons. And so if you're setting up a 20-gallon tank, that makes sense or whatever. And you just want to do it so that the salinity is about 50% of what it would be at ocean water strength.
Okay.
And most of the containers will say, this one does half a cup per gallon of water. And so you just do a quarter of a cup per gallon of water or
So
whatever.
pretty much just half the recipe on the
Yeah,
bag.
exactly. You just dilute the recipe twice as much as it says to.
And do you actually measure salinity with a meter, or do you just not even worry about that?
You don't need to because the shrimp are so flexible that if you are, say, you're 30% salinity of seawater or you're 70% salinity of seawater, they're going to be fine. So there's really no need to. The only thing you have to think about is if, when you're maintaining that tank over time, if you're removing any large quantities of water from the tank, you might need to figure out salinity, at least kind of estimate where you are. Like in my case, because I am removing water to, ship shrimp, I need to be careful because there's topping off with distilled water. Since the salt's not evaporating, you just add distilled water to a tank. If you're never removing shrimp or you're never removing water from your tank, and that's the cool thing is water changes are not actually necessary with the shrimp. And I know some people are going to freak out when I say that, but I keep aquaria. I have something like 12 aquaria in my house. I don't even know the number, something like that. And I have a water changing system and I do water changes faithfully, frequently. It's a thing. Okay. I agree with it. It's necessary, keeps my fish and my axolotl, all these creatures happy. I don't do it with these shrimp because it's just not necessary.
If you're using halogen bulbs as a heat source, then the last thing you want to use is an on-off thermostat, because then you'll actually flick the bulb off when the temperature is too high, and that's a distraction and an annoyance to your animal. It is much better and much preferred to use a dimming thermostat. That's why I want to tell you about ZooMed's new product, the Repti Temp Dimming Thermostat. This is a high accuracy dimming temperature control for your pet's habitat. It has both a daytime and a nighttime setting, so you could also use it to control something that's a non-light emitting heat source like a heat pad or a ceramic heat emitter or a heat projector. It has an adjustable ramp up and ramp down period for gradual temperature changes. And for me, I'm all about simulating sunrise, so you can slowly bring temperatures up. It is much more natural than just turning the heat on in one fell swoop. It has a sleek, low-profile housing as well as a battery backup, so you don't lose any of your data or your inputs on power interruptions. If you're someone who's striving to continue to replicate nature in its most natural form, then you need to have the ability to ramp your heat on and ramp your heat off. Turning things on and off aggressively is a lot for the animal to handle. It is much more natural for things to come up and off in a slow, gradual pace, just like Mother Nature. So if you're looking for something that can control your temperature in a much more accurate and fine-tuned way, make sure you check out ZooMed's new Repti Temp Dimming Thermostat. For more information on this or any other ZooMed product, make sure you head to zoomed.com or check out the link in the show notes or the YouTube description.
And so
as it evaporates, you top up with distilled water. Your salinity theoretically shouldn't change as long as you're not actually removing the salt water out with a cup.
right.
Like you said, if you're scooping the shrimp up or something. And
Right.
that's enough to keep the water fresh.
Exactly. And so for me, it's a little more complicated because I am removing water, so I have to pay attention to that. But if you're just keeping them, you don't need to. And because the bioload of these shrimp is so low, your water's going to be fine.
Yeah, and judged by the snow globe thing, they're not killing themselves with ammonia after 30 years. It's pretty crazy.
Right. Right.
So
So it's the proof's in the pudding, I guess.
yeah, exactly. And then what about the decor? As far as when you're keeping these shrimp, do you try to replicate those pools, what they might look like, or do you just kind of do whatever you want because they're so versatile they can exist in any sort of decor scenario?
Well, they can exist in many different decor scenarios, like you said. I've seen people decorate very heavily with like plastic plants and with seashells and all sorts of things like that. And you can. It's not going to hurt them. Anything that's aquarium safe basically is okay for them. But I tend to try to make it look a little more natural. And so what I'll do is on the bottom, I'll put some kind of buffering substrate. So something that releases calcium carbonate into the water because they need that. And so you need to do that in some way. And I tend to do it with the substrate. You can just add chunks of calcium carbonate, or you can add, pieces of coral. There's a lot of ways to do that, crushed coral, whatever. But I tend to get like aragonite sand, which is just basically calcium carbonate sand, put that on the bottom. Or I've used the African cichlids buffering substrates,
Yeah.
the same thing. And so you put some of that on the bottom. And then I like to put some lava rock, which you can get for landscape use. You can get for use with barbecue grills, and you can choose your size. There's horticultural lava rock too. And generally you can get it pretty cheaply. And you just get a bag of that. I like to get the chunks that are around 1 inch to 2 inches. So 2.5 to 5 centimeters in diameter, and just pile them up a little bit. And when you do, you're creating essentially in miniature those cracks and crevices and spots that they would use in the wild. And they do. They very readily go into those little cracks and crevices in the lava. And I've seen various setups. Some people pile up on one side of the tank all the way up to the top, this big mountain of it,
Mm.
and then the rest of the pool is kind of the tank is more open. And some people just keep it more on the bottom and put 2 or 3 inches of it and then call it good. Whatever. I just tend to make a pile or two somewhere in the tank and let them do their thing. And they really seem to, they spend a lot of time there, but they spend a lot of time out of it as well.
Yeah, that's cool. And I want to just jump back to the calcium for a second. You made the point that it's important. I just want to make sure folks caught that. So is it the pH you're trying to alter, or they actually require the calcium dissolved into the water for their health?
It's both. They do need some calcium because they are pulling calcium from the water to create their exoskeletons. That's part of what a component of their exoskeletons. And so if you don't have that calcium in there, you're limiting that. And then it does help buffer the pH as well. So it does both. And very, very important. So whatever method you choose, some people just, like I said, they get some crushed coral at a marine aquarium store and put it in, or you can use large pieces of coral or a carbonate rock like a Texas Holy Rock or something like that. Or you can just put the sand in like I do.
Yeah, and since you're actually not doing water changes, you will actually increase the calcium content of the water over time. With those other substrates, if you're doing like 50% water change every 7 days or something, it's hard for those substrates to actually buffer your water column. But if you're actually not doing water changes, then it would actually do that.
Right.
So then what about filtration, or just you talked about the importance of having some ability to oxygenate the water, but I imagine you're not running like a hang off the back situation. They're getting sucked into there. So what do you do for water movement?
Nothing actually. I have experimented with it. I've had tanks where I have water movement through a filter years and years ago, when I was kind of figuring some stuff out. I used an undergravel filter in one of the tanks. I had another tank that was set on a timer, so it would aerate the tank for. I had an air tube go into it with an air pump, and every 15 minutes or so it would turn on for a few minutes and aerate the tank and whatnot. I did some stuff like that, but you really don't need to, and you can, but it doesn't really seem to benefit the shrimp at all, honestly. And some people may find that, mileage may vary depending on your specific setup and the density of shrimp and all these different things. But in general, and this is a philosophy I learned from that website I mentioned, petshrimp.com, which really kind of helped guide my husbandry when I found it back years ago. And I guess I was keeping and breeding the shrimp without knowing that before, but I think it just made it kind of easier, is that the philosophy is basically if you don't need to do it and the shrimp can thrive, then you don't do it. And I know we talk about this a lot in various hobbies, like in the reptile hobby and so on. There are some things you can do where an animal is perfectly fine, and then you can enrich that animal's life and make it much better.
Yes.
And so I would argue that perfectly fine in that case isn't really perfectly fine if enrichment will actually help that animal, right?
Yeah.
That an animal can survive and breed and live out its lifespan without thriving. But with these shrimp, it really does not seem necessary at all to do things like that, and they can still thrive.
Mm. And in some ways, it could be almost the opposite, right? Like they have evolved in a scenario where there's very little input, right? It's just sort of these secluded, isolated pools that don't have they don't really have any movement of water besides, like you said, the tide up and down, but that's not going to be a massive amount of aeration, maybe some rain, flaking in once in a while, but adding too much could also be a problem.
Right. And aeration, if you got it too rough, it might actually damage the babies. They are planktonic, so they're floating around for a couple of weeks when they're first born, and that could actually damage them. I did find in the tanks where I did aerate, I didn't see as much reproduction.
Interesting.
Not to say that you couldn't figure out a perfect, level at which it's not harming the babies and whatnot. You probably could, but why do it if you don't need to? If I'm constantly getting babies without it and they're constantly growing up and, I can see the colonies actually thriving, then no need to mess with it.
And there is air exchange happening on the surface of the water.
Definitely.
So it's not like it's not happening at all.
Right. So I don't do anything to boost it from that point, but it's definitely needs to occur. And I have had people, and this is worth mentioning. I have had people contact me and say, I have this set up with the shrimp. I want to put shrimp in it eventually, and the algae is not growing in it because, and we'll talk more about that later. But to help get the tank ready, you want to let it mature for a while, right? And they'll say, no algae is growing in it. And I'll ask them a little bit about it, and they'll tell me, oh, it's sealed. Because they get the idea probably from these things that are sold, the commercial units that are sold, and say, oh, well, it's sealed, so I'm going to seal mine. And I say, well, I actually don't recommend that you seal it entirely. You can definitely reduce evaporation. On mine, like I have a 10-gallon aquarium and a 5.5-gallon aquarium with them in it, and I just have a normal glass lid like you would for an aquarium and a light on top.
Yeah.
That works great. I also have a 3-gallon, like a vase or vase that's tall and thin. It's 3 gallon it's about, I don't know, this tall, something like that. And I just put, it turns out that a glass pie plate fits right on top of it. And there's just enough gap around it that there's plenty of oxygen exchange, but it reduces the evaporation. And I've also used like the candy jars with the lids, kind of the little pointed lid with the globe on the top.
Yeah.
I have a 2-gallon enclosure like that for some of mine. And I just leave the lid on loosely. And once again, oxygen exchange occurs, but evaporation is minimized. So it minimizes the maintenance.
Right. Okay. No, that's good.
I do need to top it off, but instead of topping it off every month, I might only need to top it off every 4 or 5 months or whatever.
Right. And then what about temperature? That's another thing that I think, you think about these pools, they probably are pretty variable as well.
Yeah. Yeah, they are pretty variable. And because they're going underground, it's going to be a lot cooler underground and whatnot. And then if the pools are in the sun, it's going to be pretty warm and whatnot. So these are one of those creatures that really are fine at what most people would experience as room temperature. Someone living in a very, very hot place, it might get a little warm for them. But I lived in Hawaii with them, in a house that didn't have air conditioning, and they did fine. So they're doing fine in these tropical temperatures. And I keep some of mine, not all of them, but some of them in a wide windowsill in my house where the temperatures regularly get down into the 60s, a low 60s Fahrenheit. So I'm not very good at converting anymore. I used to be better at it.
Where's my chart? Yeah, like 15. Yeah, 15 is 59. So that's close. So some 15, 16 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, and they are totally fine that way, still breeding and everything. And the website, petshrimp.com, has mentioned that in California, he keeps some of his outside and have had them go down to Southern California, so it's pretty warm, but had them go down to the water in the tanks to 39 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's like, what is that? 3.8 Celsius?
Yeah, that's cold. Yeah.
And they're fine, and they're breeding, and they're not even worried about it. So I would say as long as you have reasonable or even sub-reasonable room temperatures, you're probably fine.
I forgot to warn you before we started recording that when my lights go up behind me, I just turn into this blue orb. Like my actual camera is recording, but when I record with the person, they see my webcam, and I just I'm glowing now, so that's how I'll be for the rest. But
kind of a cool effect.
Yeah. So you had mentioned, so I want to jump into diet and feeding them, and I wonder if that's a good way to link into the maturing the tank as well. Is because that you had just mentioned that, and I feel like that's a really important point. So maybe we'll start with setting up the tank, like letting it mature after you've set it up, and then how that leads into the diet, like maintenance diet.
Okay, yeah. Well, as we set up the tank, so we've talked a little bit about the seawater and how you need to do the 50% salinity, level of seawater. Getting that substrate in there, we haven't really talked about yet. Generally, you want to rinse that substrate pretty thoroughly because there'll be little particles, and it's not going to hurt the shrimp, but it's messy and it looks, ugly if you have the water all cloudy for a week or two, or however long it takes to settle, depending on what it is. So you probably want to rinse that out and then get as much of that rinse water out as you can, because they're really sensitive to chlorine. There are a few things they're very sensitive to, and one of them is chlorine, chloramines, that kind of stuff in the water. So you want to get all that out as much as you can. And then once you get that on the bottom, you get some Decor in there. One thing that people often forget to do is mix the seawater appropriately. And so what I would recommend is to use a separate container, like a bucket or something like that, and mix the seawater in it. So put all the distilled water in, stir the salt in, and use a pump. You can use an air stone, you can use just like a pump, a submersible drop-in power head or something like that, to make sure that water is really mixed. And it may take hours, or may want to even leave it overnight, so that all of that salt water is thoroughly mixed. It's not pooling down at the bottom of a hypersaline level at the bottom and then almost fresh at the top, which can happen if you just drop it in. You want to mix it in really thoroughly and then get it into the tank. And we're assuming now you have the substrate, you have the Decor, and either in the substrate or the Decor or both, you have something with calcium carbonate in it, like we mentioned. Then, and your Decor, which, like I said, you can do the piles of lava rock, you can do whatever you want. The Decor is debatably not necessary. There are plenty of people who keep them without the Decor. I like to put it in there, and I think it's more natural for the shrimp, but you don't necessarily need it. I mean, they will breed and live without it, but I've always used it. So you get that in there, and now comes to the time of maturing the tank. You need to let that tank sit for a number of weeks. Typically, it's around 6 weeks to 2 months, but it varies, depending on various factors, how much light and temperature and all that stuff it's going to take. But you need to wait until you see some algae growing on the glass or the Decor or something like that. Once you see that growing, you know that it's ready. So you can boost it by making sure you get enough light. Artificial light is fine on the aquarium. If you put a light, like I said, I have just aquarium lights like the ones you use for normal fish tanks for plant growth. You can put one on there. You can that will work. You can put it in a bright indirect light where it's not really going to get direct sunlight, but it's going to get some daylight from a window or whatever. Something along those lines. When you see algae, you can start adding the shrimp. Some things you can do to speed that up. Beyond light, you can add some existing algae, which you can get a lot of times when you get the shrimp. The people who offer the shrimp for sale will provide some algae along with the shrimp, or they might sell it separately or whatever. I like to include some when I sell them. I put them in, I put some of the algae in with the shrimp so they have something to cling to in the bag when they're shipping. That seems to reduce their stress. And then you also have some of that algae to start. But sometimes, but it's ideal if you can get some of that algae ahead of time so that it's already growing in the tank. And that probably goes along with some spores of the types of algae that grow on glass, because the type of algae that I'm mentioning that I ship with them doesn't grow on glass. It's kind of it's a macroalgae that looks a little bit like some of the ones that you'd keep in a marine aquarium, but on a smaller scale. And so if you include some of that, that can help. And then the snails that I mentioned, the Malaysian trumpet snails, if you put a few of those in the tank and not just drop ones from a freshwater tank directly in, that could be a little stressful for them. They'd probably survive it, honestly, but it could be kind of stressful for them. So I recommend acclimating them a little bit more slowly to that salt water, which you can do basically by keeping them in a freshwater container and then adding 1/4 of the volume of the water in that container of salt water one day, and then add another dose the next day, and then they're fine after that, and you can just put them in. Once they're in there, they should be fine, and you don't need to feed the snails or anything like that. Just let them go around and eat biofilm as it's created and whatnot in there for a few weeks, and that they will help kind of get some bacterial growth and some biofilm going by their just existing and producing waste and so on being in there. So about 6 weeks to 2 months later, you should find some algae starting to grow in the tank, and you're ready to put shrimp in.
And then if you wanted to speed it up greatly, could you just run a light 24/7 on there just to help promote algae growth, or is that not going to do anything for you?
You could, yeah, you could definitely do that, and then just I'd recommend reducing it to a more natural photo period afterwards. But yeah,
yes, of course, yeah. Even without, you wouldn't maybe even want to do that with snails, but if you just had your own tank with nothing else in it and you're just trying to boost the algae, that would work.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to speed it up. And I think I've had some people ask about that in the past, and yeah, it makes sense. And one of the hardest things about keeping these shrimp is that weight. Honestly,
yes, yeah.
People worry about that, and I've had people contact me. I think I'm ready. What do you think? And they'll send me pictures, and I say, let's wait a little longer. And
so, what do you look for? Like, what do you want to see from a tank that you think is matured?
You just want to see some algae growing on the glass or the decor,
and that's it. Like just like a certain amount, or
basically, if it's visible, if you can see it growing there, you're probably fine. That's
okay.
Probably more than enough.
And can you let it, because that's another thing I've seen people, because algae is always in the aquarium hobby, it's a thing you're battling, but I've seen some people embrace it with fish tanks and allow like a lot of algae to grow, and actually like almost like once you get through the ugly phase, it's actually a really unique feature of those tanks.
Yeah.
Can you do that in the shrimp tank? Could you allow the algae to almost overgrow, or would that cause oxygen issues?
It seems to be fine. I have different tanks with different levels of, depending on the purpose of the tank. Like I have some tanks that I don't really take from very often that are kind of like my reservoirs of shrimp. And the ones that I keep in the window, I let the algae kind of grow quite a bit, and it's fine. One of them for the nerite that eats the algae, and but yeah, it's fine. It doesn't seem to bug the shrimp at all. And then I have one that's just basically display. I rarely take shrimp out of it. I have it in my office. It's a 5.5 gallon, and it has lava rock set up in kind of a hardscape to look nice. And then I've got 2 species of algae, and one of them is the one that I got from petshrimp.com like forever ago. And then another one I got with another group of shrimp that somebody else shipped me, and they both grow in there, and they're kind of like the carpet. And they look different. They have a different texture to them. So one is kind of more a muted green, and it's very soft, like gossamer sort of feathery, furry look to it. And then the other one looks more like it's kind of a tangled look to it, but neither one of them will grow on the glass. They don't attach themselves to the glass. And so you can kind of control, and they grow fairly slowly, which is nice. It's probably partly an artifact of the low nutrient levels in the water, but they tend to grow quite slowly. And so you can control where they're growing, you can clip them back, and you can do whatever you want. And sometimes I just let them go wild. And depending on, what's the purpose of the tank and so on. But they kind of form a carpet, and because they are green and the shrimp are red and they get the complementary color thing going, it's really pretty fun. And then in the tank at work, which is, like I said, the display tank, you have these large pieces of lava rock jutting out from this algae carpet. So it's kind of a cool look.
Yeah, that is very cool. And I guess for people who are listening, let's say they don't have any access to algae will still show up, which is kind of the bizarre thing. You're putting distilled water in there with salt, but eventually you're going to have a plant, not a plant, but some organism in there that just makes its way there. But that's going to be algae that's going to grow on the glass and probably everywhere.
Right. And that's true. And it does appear, and people ask me, how does it appear there? And well, there are some forms of algae that just have airborne spores, and they'll get there. And a lot of algae that can function and grow just fine in a variety of salinities. And so you can get this airborne algae that'll drop in there and do it. And that's why, one of the reasons why I tell people, if your container is completely sealed, and that's why you're not getting any algae show up, is because you sealed it right away and you didn't give a chance for any of those spores to get in there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to think that there's just algae spores floating around. But I mean, you go to any ditch around your area, you're going to see some algae in there, or whatever it is. Any body of water is going to have something. So it's in the air. It's just around. It'll make its way to your tank.
Exactly. And it does, and it's kind of fascinating. And you don't need to purchase algae for it to, like you said, it'll just show up. That is perfectly fine for the shrimp as far as their survival and everything. As far as aesthetics, if you want some to purchase to put on the bottom and just kind of speed up the maturation of the tank, you can do it, but it's not necessary by any means.
Right. And then what about just feeding maintenance wise? I mean, now you have the algae growth and you can add the shrimp in and they're eating the algae. Do you feed them on a somewhat consistent basis something else?
Yeah, yeah. But the important thing is once you've put the shrimp in and people ask, oh, do you need to drip acclimate them or whatnot? Typically, no, you don't. So once your shrimp arrive, if you let them sit next to the container that you're going to put them in whatever container they arrive in, you let them sit there for 15, 20 minutes so the temperatures are, approximately equal. And if there's a big temperature differential between outside and inside or whatever, maybe a little longer, maybe an hour or two, then just put them in. Just pour all the water that came with them into the tank and they're fine. They don't need to do all the acclimation stuff. But then don't feed them for at least a couple of months.
Okay.
Because there's going to be that algae that's in there and they really don't need anything. And if you put if you put food in there too soon, it can be toxic for them. This acclimation period from the time you set up the tank and that maturation, and then the first couple of months, that's kind of the tricky period of the shrimp. But tricky only in the sense that everybody feels like, I need to do something. I really ought to be doing something for these shrimp. Basically, you could forget you had them for 2 or 3 months and they would be better off.
Wow. So you almost have like a 6-month period where you're setting up your tank. You got to wait 2 months-ish to get them going, and then you're putting them into the tank, and then you're going to wait at least another 2 or 3 months before you actually have to do anything.
Right.
Maintenance-wise, besides maybe top up the water.
Right. And depending on how much surface area and the evaporation that's happening, you may need to top them off. But yeah, other than that, no maintenance during that period at all, which is awesome. Makes it really easy. One thing I tell people when they ask, like, how much work does it really take and whatever, is that during lockdown, I had my office tank and I wasn't allowed to go in the office very often.
Right.
And so in a period of 5 months, I was able to perform maintenance twice. So I went in and I topped off the water and I fed the shrimp twice during those 5 months. Came
Wow.
back and the algae in the tank had started to die off because it was low on nutrients.
And the shrimp were fine.
But the shrimp were fine.
That is crazy.
And then the algae, eventually I was thinking, oh, I need to bring some algae from home to replace what had passed away. It had turned white, and just kind of died. And I thought, oh, well, okay, maybe I'll replace it. But I never really got around to it. I kind of wanted to see what happened. And I saw these little strands of green algae growing back again. And now it's fine. It just slowly grew back.
Oh, that's cool. And so when you do feed them, what are you feeding them?
There are a couple of different things you can feed them. One really easy thing to do is just put in a small pellet of fish food.
Okay.
I'd like to put in like a sinking pellet that is that contains some of the natural things like astaxanthins, carotenoids that give the shrimp their color in the wild. And so if you include some of those in the food, and a lot of these fish foods, if you get one of the color foods, that's what they include. And some people think of those as, an artificial colorant for the fish or the shrimp in this case. They're not, because they're naturally getting astaxanthins, carotenoids, and stuff in their food. We're just
Right.
kind of giving it to them in a slightly different way because they're not grazing on all these varieties of algae and whatnot that they'd find in the wild and get those. So that is a really good thing to use. And it's just a very minimal amount. Like I have my biggest tank right now that I have for them is a 10-gallon. And I have, how many tanks do I have? 1, 2, like 4, 5 tanks, something like that, of them. And the biggest one is a 10-gallon. I will put 2 or 3 small pellets of food in there. And I can go, it depends on, what's going on at the time and so on, how many shrimp I have in there, because that can fluctuate if I sell a whole bunch or whatever. But with a large population of shrimp, I'm still only putting 2 or 3 pellets in there, maybe once a month, something like that. And they will come and swarm all over the pellet and eat it, and then until it's gone, and then disappear. And one of the videos that I'll send you a link to it. It shows a it's a video that I took quite a few years ago, but I drop a pellet of food in there and then put it on time lapse. And you can see all these shrimp form around it, form it into a ball. And it's like they're pushing it around the tank. And they're just this huge ball of shrimp that they just push around the tank. And you can see the snails zipping around in fast motion and everything. It's kind of fun to see. One of the most fun things about keeping these shrimp is when they get to that point when there is enough of them that they have this feeding frenzy and you watch them go crazy. And because you're not feeding them all that often, they really respond really well to the food. In fact, if you find that they're not responding very well to the food, you're probably overfeeding them. You need to back off a little bit.
Right. Wow, that's fascinating. And so, as far as keeping the colony going, how do you prevent like overpopulation or them just breeding into just having way too many of them in the volume of water?
They tend to do pretty well with that themselves. They tend to self-regulate. You could potentially overfeed a tank, and it would be a fine balance where you were overfeeding the tank to the point where maybe they're breeding too much. But at the same time, when you overfeed the tank and too many nitrates build up in the tank, the shrimp tend not to breed.
Okay, interesting.
So they seem to regulate, I mean, really well. And like I was saying before, you could keep maybe 50 to 100, something like that, shrimp in a gallon of water, whatever. And my 5.5 gallon at work, I don't know how many hundreds of shrimp that are in there, but they're not anywhere near overcrowding it.
Right.
So I could probably just let them keep going. I have occasionally removed shrimp. I think actually only once I removed like 5 or 10 shrimp from that tank, and they've just been breeding, and it's not a problem. They've never gotten it anywhere close to overpopulating. My 10 gallon, I do tend to take shrimp out of it to sell to other keepers and whatnot, and so that's never going to get overcrowded because I'm removing shrimp from it. But I'm surprised at how many shrimp always show up in there. I'm like, I just removed 50 shrimp from there last week, and you can't even tell.
Yeah.
So I would say, and I'm setting up a 20 gallon soon, and that'll be the biggest one I've ever done. And I'm reasonably sure I could have, I don't know, 1,000 shrimp in there before worrying about it being overcrowded.
Wow.
Maybe not
That's
even.
really cool. And do people ever use do you use them as feeders, or is it not really practical because they don't breed as much as you'd like them to if for that scenario?
Well, that's the thing. They don't breed nearly as quickly as a lot of these other like red cherry shrimp or other cherry shrimp that people keep in the hobby. Those have a lot more reproductive potential. They have larger clutches of eggs, and they're going to have them a lot more often. So you can get, thousands and thousands of like cherry shrimp pretty fast. And these are just slower. Not that they don't breed regularly. I mean, I look in my tank almost all the time and there are babies floating around. It's always happening.
Yeah.
But they're not going to be producing nearly as many and nearly as often as like red cherry shrimp. So I don't use them as feeders. Generally, when they are used as feeders, like I mentioned for the seahorses, what's happening is you're getting people harvesting them from these pools directly.
Right.
Doesn't really make economic sense to breed them in large quantities as feeders because they don't breed fast enough. But if someone has an access to the pool, I mean, they're essentially all these shrimp coming from long distances to use this pool, and so they can collect huge numbers of them. I don't really think that's the best thing for the shrimp, considering that these pools are pretty rare. Should probably be conserving them, I think, in the wild, and make sure that what is kept in the hobby is captive bred. I think that's important. But now there are so many people breeding them, and there really is no barrier to breeding them. We can talk about how that works, but I really don't understand why people aren't, for hobby use. I understand from an economic standpoint why people are collecting them from these pools. I don't really agree with it, but I see why they're doing it from an economic standpoint. But as far as collecting them for the hobby, the numbers that people keep in a hobby and so on, there's no reason not to captive breed them. It's super easy. And
yeah, just by virtue of owning them, you're going to be a captive breeder.
Yeah, and it just makes sense. There's no reason to collect them in the wild and then sell them as like pets. Just get them from somebody who's captive breeding them.
And that goes for anybody looking to buy. Try to make sure you're buying from somebody who has bred them.
Right. And in general, that's going to mean someone I mean, if someone says I have a wild pool of them or something, and I'm breeding them that pool or something, that's not really what they're doing. They're collecting them. So
Yeah.
if you can see their setup and like this is the tank that I have and they're breeding and that kind of thing, that's a way. And of course, they're not going to be wild collecting them if they're not in Hawaii. They're not going to be wild collecting them unless they're importing them, which is possible. You have to look into that too.
Now, do you have a sense of from egg to visibility with your naked eye? How long would that be?
Well, it looks like it can be hard to like measure exactly how long everything takes, but when I look into a tank, it's not uncommon to see the females with the little eggs that you can see. They're very visible. They're very red, and the eggs are always red. Like even when the female pales out because she's stressed or whatever, and stress sometimes can happen when you just you close the lid of the tank. It
Yeah.
depends on various shrimp. And some shrimp don't seem to change color at all. Like they say red pretty much all the time, and some change color a lot. And they do vary by individual and what else. All those things have an impact. But the eggs are very red. You can see them on the female. And then it's usually within a month or so, might be a little longer. It probably depends on temperature too, the speed of development. But month, maybe two, you see that the babies start to look not like eggs, but you can see they're these little larvae attached to the female swimmerets. And then when you see that, it's going to be really soon. It's going to be a day or two, and she's going to be releasing them. And then pretty soon you just see a whole bunch of little ones floating in the water. And unlike like the cherry shrimp in the hobby, once they hatch, they're not like miniature replicas of the adults. They're a larval form. They're planktonic. They don't have walking legs. They have these swimming structures that their head faces down, their tail faces up, and they have these little swimming legs, and they will just sort of zip around in the water, but not like directionally. They're just sort of wandering around. They are attracted to light. So if you have a light on the top of the aquarium, you'll see a whole bunch collect under that light. And they'll do that for about 2 weeks. You don't need to feed them anything special. From what I understand, they just have kind of a yolk sac that they subsist on during this period. So you don't have to make sure, I need to get these tiny little food items for them or anything like that. They don't need anything. And you just leave them with the adults. The adults won't bother them. And then about 2 weeks after you see them appear in the water column, they just molt and they look like little adults, and they go on their way.
Okay, so you can actually still see them at that planktonic stage, without like using a magnifying glass or anything like that.
Right, as long as you have pretty good eyesight. The magnifying glass is certainly nice. I do recommend keeping a magnifying glass next to the tank or some sort of magnifying device. Of course, everybody can do that with their phone these days, too, so you can see some of the details you can't normally see. But yeah, they're very visible. They're probably, I want to say, probably something like 2 to 2.5 millimeters long.
Okay.
When they first hatch.
Okay, so that's fairly big, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and we had mentioned something a while ago that I wanted to make sure we come back to was options for live plants. So beyond the algae, what are some things that people could plant in those tanks that do well with them?
There aren't a lot of options, honestly, that are easily accessible. Let me put it that way. Besides the algae that we talked about. I forgot to tell you some more things about food too, because there's some other options I want to talk about, but I'll try to get back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Yeah.
Brackish water is a really inhospitable environment for so many plants, just completely inhospitable. So you do get people who say, hey, I've heard that Java fern and Java moss and Anubias or whatever, these can do well in brackish water. I'm going to try it. And the thing is, those plants might do okay at a much lower salinity than 50%, but they're not going to do well at 50% for very long. They might do well enough for a month or two and look okay and they're green, and then a few months later, they're just dead. And so people tend to say, hey, it's working, and then it's not. So I don't recommend trying to acclimate any freshwater plants at all. There are some brackish water plants that can work. Mangrove plants technically can survive very well at brackish water. I've never experimented with it, but I thought it would be really cool someday to have a huge setup with some really bright lights above, maybe in a greenhouse or something, and have some mangroves growing out of a tank that has just thousands of these shrimp in it, I think that would be really cool. At the same time, mangroves require a lot of nutrients, maybe more nutrients than the shrimp could handle. You'd probably have to do some sort of fertilization regimen that might not work for the shrimp in that case, but technically there's something that could be possible there. There are some brackish water plants like I think one of the species is Rupia maritima. It's kind of a grassy looking plant that apparently occurs within the natural range of the Opaiula, and I've seen people growing it in their tanks, but it's not a plant you can easily obtain. I've never figured out a way to get a hold of it. So there are some things like that that may work. I've seen some other types of macroalgae that exist in marine aquaria that people can grow in marine aquaria that you can put in there. Sometimes those will just overgrow the tank like they do in marine aquaria if you don't trim them excessively. And then you have this idea, a lot of these algae require a lot of nutrients and the shrimp don't. And so they sort of contradict each other in terms of if you're benefiting one by not, meeting its nutrient needs, then you're probably causing the other some stress.
Right. Yes. Yeah. By virtue of where they've evolved, they're in a non-nutrient rich environment.
Right. And so it can be tricky, but I've seen some success. And so anyone who's interested in that, I mean, you can go onto the petshrimp.com forum and they people talk about what they found, but a lot of times people say, hey, this is working. And then after a few months, it's not anymore or whatever. Or I liked this at first, but now it's growing like crazy and I have to cut it back all the time. And it's not really what I wanted. And, so I recommend just kind of going with the algae that have been tried and true. There's another one I should mention. There's these mini moss balls. And if people have been in the pet store and seen the Marimo moss balls that people use and put in with bettas or put in their aquarium or
yes, yeah.
Not the same thing, but it is, people can confuse the two. But there's these mini moss balls that people keep with the shrimp. And some people have managed to have them thrive and they look really cool and they just kind of grow into these round balls and then they reproduce and you get more of them. And I've tried them a couple of times and not had a lot of success. I got them to the point where I had some mini balls and it looked like they were growing, but then they just sort of petered out. So that's something maybe worth trying for some people. Didn't work for me, but these other, the two types of algae that I have worked really well, and you get sort of the carpet effect, and you can choose if you want the fluffy algae or if you want the one that's more like a tangled algae, whatever. Both of those can work, or you can do both. And I think that is.
Do they have a name? Like, how would somebody find those?
Well, if you go to the petshrimp.com website, they have it. And I'm not affiliated with the website or anything. I know I keep mentioning it because they're kind of like the go-to in a lot of ways, but I'm not affiliated with them. I don't make any money from anything. When I talk about it, I'm just full disclosure there. They sell it.
Okay.
They sell one of the types, and for use with the shrimp. When I sell shrimp, I do the same thing. I just provide some with the shrimp, or people can purchase it ahead of time if they want to get their colony going with it. And the best way to do it is probably to contact a hobbyist who already keeps the shrimp and see if they have some, or just purchase it.
Okay, cool. Do you want to double back to, it said there's some food things that you didn't recommend that you wanted to mention?
Yeah. So in addition to the fish food, one thing you can do is get just like pure spirulina powder.
Okay.
And sprinkle it on the top of the water, and they'll come up and you can see them kind of grabbing at it and so on, and sort of skimming it off the surface. And that is good for their color because it has a lot of natural colorants in it. And I've used also astaxanthin, which is, I've used Hematococcus algae powder, which you can purchase, which has astaxanthin in it. So I think the spirulina has more carotenoids in it. So it's good to balance those two out. You can use both of them, and then that helps the shrimp to maintain and develop red color. When they're really small, they're not very red, and as they grow, they'll get more red. But if they don't have the proper nutrients, they won't be as red. So it's good to make sure you're supplementing those in one way or another, and then redder shrimp.
Yeah, and that's probably a goal for everybody. You want some nice red shrimp in there,
right? And people need to keep in mind too that when you first get your shrimp, they're most likely going to be stressed out because they've been traveling, whether you pick them up from a local hobbyist or you buy them at a store or you had them shipped, whatever, they're going to be stressed out. And so they're not likely to be red. and probably won't gain their full color for some time. It might be days, it might be weeks, might even be months, but they'll eventually get redder.
So
And
don't panic.
don't panic. And another thing too is if there is decor, which like I said, I do recommend in the tank, the shrimp will probably hide in it quite a bit at first. And you might think, oh, what did I do? I've killed these things off, or I'm never going to see these. Why did I buy them? Both of those could go through your mind. But over time, they will become a lot more active, and I'll share some of the clips with you, like we said, and you can see the shrimp just all over the tank all the time. They're very, very active. And they don't seem to shut down. It doesn't seem to matter what time of day it is, whether the light's on, whether the light's off. They're just constantly milling around. And especially when you have high density in there, you're always going to see activity. It's just always going to be going on. So just that first period, there's usually a little while where they're kind of shy, and then they'll start coming out, and pretty soon they'll just be out all the time. And as they reproduce, especially and the density goes up, you're going to see more and more of that. And so it's part of the process. It's not something to worry about.
Yeah, you got to get through that acclimation phase, but they do sound like such a good pet for anybody listening who's like everybody's animal people, so everybody's wanting to add another animal to their room anyway, so something that's really low maintenance. But also, I just think younger kids who want to get into keeping pets in some capacity, that's a pretty low responsibility animal once it's set up properly. If they forget to feed it once a month, it's not a big deal, and
Right.
it's just it. And the fact that they do have that activity once they are acclimatized to this to the setup, you could have them on your desk and look over and see a bunch of little shrimp milling around, and it's just a nice little. And that they have an ample space and lots of quote unquote enrichment within that space. It's I think they're a fascinating creature that definitely doesn't have enough credit.
Yeah, I would agree. They're so fun, and especially in these days where people are thinking, and I agree with the philosophy that you talk about a lot on your shows. We should think about getting smaller things. We should think about getting things that we can take care of easily and actually provide an optimal environment for them. And I think this is something we can do. And it is really hard to provide an optimal environment for almost anything in such a small space, but you really can do it with these shrimp.
Yeah, I think the snow globes are the perfect. That's like and if they can survive that, then just giving them something a little bit better than that can really make it more interesting. Plus, it's more interesting for the keeper too. You don't want to just look at an empty ball of water and
Right. Right.
watch
And
it
you can really get into it if you want to with the aquascapes and put in all kinds of fun stuff. I've seen people make some really interesting setups. The aquarium in Waikiki in Hawaii had a really cool setup that basically um, had these rock slabs and everything and lava and everything. So it really looked like an ankyline pool. And it was
That's
fun
cool.
just to see them. And I've kind of tried to do that. I don't think mine looks quite as aesthetically pleasing. I don't think my tanks look as aesthetically pleasing as theirs, but I think I kind of go for that vibe too, to some degree, and it's fun.
Now, if somebody wants to purchase a colony, do you have any recommendations, or is it just best to go to petshrimp.com and see who's working with them? Like you said, you don't really see them common in your regular local fish shop.
Right, right, and yeah, just look around. People are petshrimp.com has basically a store and to sell these shrimp, and so you can pretty much always find them there. They produce a lot of shrimp, and they are captive bred, producing them all in-house, and so that's a safe place to go. And you can look around. I sell them too. Other people do, and I'm not doing that as a commercial or whatever. You don't have to get anything from me. I'm just saying there are others out there who breed them, and you can find them too. Just it is important. Just it bears repeating. Make sure you're getting it captive bred. You're
Yes.
getting your initial colony captive bred, because it's so much cheaper for people to go and just pull some out of a pond and sell them, but it's not really the best idea since these shrimp are so threatened in the wild.
Yeah, we don't want to be promoting that at all. So I think that's really well said. Is there anything else about the shrimp that we didn't cover that you think is worth covering, or did we hit all the main points?
Let me look real quick at my notes and see if there's anything else that I should mention. I think we talked about we circled back to the diet. I think we talked most about the husbandry. I don't think we're missing anything in the husbandry. I should talk about some of the common mistakes that people made.
Yes. Yeah. Please.
And I guess we talked about some of them. One of them was not waiting long enough for the tank to mature. People will set up a tank and say, "Oh, the bioload's going to be so low on this. I just set this up 48 hours ago. It's looking good. I'm going to drop them in." That's not a good idea. Really does need to be matured. Another one, using the wrong water. You
Tap
really
water or whatever.
yeah, they'll use tap water and they'll say, "Well, it's dechlorinated," and you may have water that would work dechlorinated. That might work, but we know that distilled water does work, and we know that a lot of tap water will kill them. So avoid the tap water. It's just
Exactly.
better. Yeah, and then overfeeding. People will overfeed them sometimes early on, and like I mentioned, the first couple of months, don't feed them at all. And just to reiterate, here's a story I should mention in relation to this. That a website that's no longer in existence, but is where I got my shrimp originally from the man who ran this website, gave an example about a professor at a university in Hawaii who collected 6 shrimp. He had a gallon jar with him, and he saw 6 of them in this anchialine pool. He collected them along with a couple of pieces of coral rubble that were there and some of the sand from the anchialine pool, and had them in this gallon jar, and brought home all the water from the pool and everything, and then put like a little ashtray type of lid on top of the jar so that it wasn't threaded down and tightened or anything. It was just sitting on top of it, but it was reducing evaporation by allowing a little bit of oxygen exchange. And he didn't open that container for 20 years.
Wow.
And at the end of 20 years, there were about 50 shrimp in there.
Wow.
And they were small, and they were smaller than your average adult shrimp. They were kind of pale, but what else could you put in a jar for 20 years and not touch and find that they had reproduced?
Yeah, not only survive, but actually reproduce at a pretty large scale.
Yeah.
That is unbelievable.
And I'm not saying that was the ideal thing to do, but it's a testament to their hardiness. People will often say when they hear about these shrimp, they're like, "Oh, I think cherry shrimp are hardier." Well, there are a lot of advantages to cherry shrimp. I love cherry shrimp. I kept cherry shrimp. But could you put 6 in a jar, and 20 years later, after just leaving that jar alone, would you find 50 cherry shrimp there? I don't think so.
No, definitely not. But that links to the overfeeding. That is, it is, they don't need a lot.
They really don't. And if you find that your shrimp are not reproducing, it may be that you're overfeeding them. And I did, when I had that period of 5 months where I could only feed them a couple of times, I did notice a little bit of like a dip in reproduction after that for a few months. But then I started feeding them, they were reproducing again. And there were still lots of healthy shrimp in the tank. There were like plenty of them. So I wasn't worried, but you need to, often people find that when they first get them, they don't reproduce right away. It might take a few months for them to reproduce. But often a good way to know that it is time to feed them is that you see them reproducing and you haven't fed them yet at all. The only thing you've done is put them in the tank, and there are babies in there. Now I can start feeding them a little bit.
Okay, that's a good tip.
Yeah. And then let's see, overcomplicating things. I guess we kind of addressed filtration is not necessary, aeration beyond the oxygen exchange that naturally occurs. You don't need to do water changes. There doesn't seem to be any benefit from it, but just make sure to top it off, like we said, with the distilled water. People worry about temperature. Do I need a heater? No, most likely don't. Lighting, just aquarium lighting is fine if you want to do that, or if you just want to have some bright indirect light without direct sunlight, that's fine too. You do have people not allowing for any ventilation, which is bad. So you do want some ventilation. And then I guess we already talked about, if you don't see very many at first when you set up your colony, don't worry, it's coming. So those are the notes that I made about common mistakes. So I guess we've pretty much covered those.
Okay. Well, I think this was a fascinating conversation. I mean, it's so interesting finding these little organisms like this that have just such a fascinating evolutionary story about them, and the fact that you can care for them in such a sparing way just tells you everything you need to know about how they exist in the wild. And I think that's so fascinating, and they do make a perfect pet. They're one of those things that are actually a perfect pet, because you know that it's actually very difficult to put them in a state where they're going to be lacking something if you do set them up in the way we talked about today. And I think that's just an amazing fact about them.
Right. It's hard to imagine an easier pet, and it's not something that you can interact with the way you can with, say, a reptile or something, or a mammal or a bird. But if you just want something that's kind of like a slice of nature that you can observe at any time, and you can observe for generations and will it to your grandkids.
Yeah.
Pretty good way to go.
Yeah. This is one of those episodes where like I go into it thinking, I know people will find this amazing and fascinating, but I don't know personally if I would ever want to keep shrimp. And now at the end of it, I'm like, damn it, I'm going to be looking up where to get these things. Cause now I'm like, this would be really cool just to have on the table over there. And just like you said, is when you can set something up in a natural way and then have a little element of an animal in there that's acting naturally, it's the best.
Yeah. I hope there are good sources of them in Canada that you can get. I would imagine.
Yeah, that'll be the next thing. Yeah.
But yeah,
I'll see. I'll know in about an hour after this when after I've done all my research. So anyway, Russ, this was fantastic. Thank you for bringing the idea to me, because again, I like these little things fly under the radar for me. So I really appreciate you coming up with the idea and sharing all this with us. Again, can you remind everybody the YouTube channel and Instagram where they can get in touch with you if they want?
Sure. Yep. Both YouTube and Instagram are Aquarimax Pets, as you can see there on the screen. And I would be happy to talk to you if you're interested in learning a little bit more about them. I'm happy to point you to some of my care videos for the shrimp or whatever. More than happy to help you and lead you to sources where you can find out more about them and even get some if you want to do that.
And are you still doing like a consistent live show on your channel?
Yeah, I do. I do it a little less because I'm trying to do more shorts because YouTube algorithm.
Yes,
but about twice a month I do the live show.
Okay, so people can go sub to your channel and then they can interact with you that way as well if they want to post questions in there.
Absolutely. Yep.
Cool. Well, Russ, until we do another one, thank you so much for jumping on the podcast and bringing this idea. Like I said, I'm already looking forward to the next thing we chat about.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm really grateful that you had me on again. It's been fun, and can't wait till the next time.
All right, that is the end of that episode. Russ, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast again and sharing all that wonderful, detailed information. Listeners, as you can tell, Russ is a wealth of information. So if you're looking for more information on not only just the shrimp, but everything else he's working on, the isopods, other fish, and invertebrates and whatnot, go check out his channel because it's a wonderful channel. And again, he just delivers information in such a digestible way that you will definitely come back from his videos with more information than when you went into them. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you let us know in the comments, either on Spotify or YouTube, and you can also share the episode on Facebook or Instagram. That really does go a long way to helping the channel grow. You can support the podcast at patreon.com/animalsathome. If you would like to buy yourself a t-shirt or a sweater, you can head to animalsathome.ca/shop, and $5 does automatically get donated to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. And I believe that is it for this one, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to Liam Sinclair over at Reptiles and Research for editing the episode. And I will catch you in the next one.